So Roland is asking, is there any difference with respect to security between Chrome and Chromium? Is there any major security differences? Well, I guess there are, right? I mean, there are some aspects, but of course, can you go ahead and answer that question?
So for the most part, Chromium and Chrome, like if you just take Chromium out of the box and build it, it has almost everything in it that's in Chrome. However, Chromium-based browsers typically only use like the content layer and below. So there do end up being security differences between other Chromium browsers because other Chromium browsers don't actually take the whole thing we package as Chromium, if that makes sense.
So is there anything at all that is different in Chrome with respect to Chromium? Like you said, if we take Chromium today, we compile it. I was thinking about Google Safe Browsing, but I guess at this point, you also get that from Chromium, from the open source version?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not 100% sure. I would expect you would.
Right.
There are some Google-backed services that are not there. So for example, on, there might be some things on the new tab page, some features that aren't present. I think Safe Browsing and Translate both work in Chromium. But I don't know if you need to provide an API key to get it to work in Chromium or not. But generally, a Chromium build is a more or less functional browser. A lot of engineers even build Chromium instead of Chrome as they're testing out their work.
I see. All right, great. So there's another question from Alan. Alan, would you like to try to ask that question live?
Sure. Thank you so much, Adriana, for your talk. And I'm a big fan of your work. And I just wanted to ask, what are the challenges for like designing security features or mitigations for both Chrome on the desktop and mobile platforms?
Sorry, how are the mitigations different on desktop versus mobile?
Oh no, like what are the challenges for designing different security features or mitigations for both desktop and mobile platforms?
So, they're actually fairly different. So Android, iOS, and desktop, although there are shared components, they kind of actually are three distinct browsers that share a brand name. So for example, on iOS, due to limitations put in place by Apple, instead of using Blink and V8, we use WK WebView, which is provided by Apple. And then, we don't have the ability, for example, to create our own processes. So, there are very real security, like on other platforms, like, oh, we'll mitigate this risk by creating a new process to execute this code in it. We're not able to do that. I think the site isolation was a lot, in general, multiple processes was much easier to do on desktop where, usually more RAM available. This was much trickier on Android. There's a lot more memory pressure on a mobile device. And so you have to be much, I think like Chrome always gets teased about how much memory you use. The main reason we're using memory is because we're putting things in separate processes for security. And that becomes more challenging on Android.
All right. And we have Carmela. Do you like to go next?
Yep. Thank you, Adriana, for the great talk. So you said that where research is really advanced is when we work on niche communities and we kind of analyze security problems or privacy issues of kind of very concrete people. And then you said that indeed kind of Chrome is a bit different because you always kind of focus on majorities. But how does one fit into the other? How does the research that we do, like how does this get integrated and how does it change the way in which you think and at the end of the day, the way in which the product evolves to also cater to those communities? Or is it the case that it is impossible to do majority and communities at the same time?
You know, I don't even know if there is a majority. I would describe the world as a collection of small communities. And so when we're making decisions, we're sort of trying to understand as many communities as we can and get a sense as to like whether the change will have like kind of like net positive or net negative and on who and in what context. And, you know, being aware of the fact that like, you know, such a thing might make the browser unusable by some group of people. You know, okay, when we go to launch, oh, maybe we'll think about adding a setting. Like maybe there's some setting that people can change, or maybe this will influence what defaults we have. But, you know, I wish I had a more like rigorous or scientific, like, oh, and then, you know, but really it's just kind of, we try to just find all the information that we can about all the different communities and then keep it in mind as we make decisions, that we understand what trade-offs we're making. But I also, yeah, I want to say there is no one majority. Like there is no one clear, like, oh, most of the world is like this. And then it's really just an accumulation of small communities.
Okay. I do have one more sort of like generic, hopefully forward-looking type of question. So my understanding is that there is at Google and probably other companies as well, sort of these, let's say, aspiration to have web apps essentially functioning like native apps. Is that correct?
Yes, that has been a goal, particularly for Chrome OS.
Right, exactly. So, and I'm thinking, you know, that's probably one of the reasons why there's, you know, a number of fairly powerful APIs, right? The powerful features that are being added progressively. And again, there is always this tension between the powerful features and the security. And I was wondering, like, obviously there is this sort of like strategic goal of having these web apps essentially function as native apps, but at the same time, there is, you know, the security aspects of these features are always quite tricky to deal with. How do you guys handle that? I mean, I'm just curious about the conversations.
Oh wow, yeah, like this has been a top topic of conversation for years now. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it comes down to, first of all, trying to figure out what the kind of minimum risk you can incur is while still implementing what's needed by developers. And then thinking through, okay, so developers need X, like how do we like mitigate it? How do we carve the security down needs as close around that developer need as possible? And then also, how do we make sure that users are aware of what it is that the developer is doing or that they're giving away to the developer? So there's generally this sort of like multi-step thing of, you know, someone comes in and they ask for like this very broad API, and then it kind of gets shaped down, and there's kind of a negotiation process between developers and the community. Say, no, that's not enough, and the security team says, but let's trim the edge here. And then, you know, if we're not able to make it where we feel confident that you know, there's no risk or trade-off at all, then, you know, that's when you ask the user for permission or tell them what is happening in some way.
Thank you. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I don't see.
There was, I think, a question in chat from Aska.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Go ahead, Aska. Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, so my question is a little bit more generic about research. So it's related to your second story. And it's, as a security researcher, do you think it's more impactful to be an expert in one niche area, or do you think it's more helpful if you are sort of a jack of all trades, you know a little bit about everything? And then a follow-up question is, would your answer change if we're talking about a security practitioner, not a security researcher?
Well, there's lots of different ways to build careers. The way that I've chosen to build mine was based on some advice I got a few years ago, and it's about building like a V-shaped career. The idea being that, you know, first you establish some core thing that you're really an expert at, that you're really good at. And then you find, you know, two things that are close to it, but a little bit different from it. And then you keep developing breadth that way, but kind of each time establishing deep expertise and then kind of like building off of it. So you end up with this kind of upside down pyramid shape. So as you know, as you're going through your career, you're maintaining some deep expertise, but adding on new skills that are closely related to what you're already good at. One of the reasons I liked that model myself was one thing that can happen if you're really just trying to establish tons and tons of breadth off the bat is that then, you know, you maybe never get depth in anything. And, you know, if you're like only sort of okay at a lot of things, that's often not as valuable as like being really good at one thing and then learning how to be really good at two more things the next year. With that being said, there's lots of ways to shape careers. That's just sort of the model that I have liked. I don't know how that differs for professors, you know, since I've never had that experience myself.
All right, thank you.
On a related note, I also want to jump in with a question that some of my grad students ask me. And so as I think they see themselves in academia, like publishing research papers, openly sharing the research. Some of the concerns I've heard from students is if we go to industry, we will never get to publish. And that is something that I think they feel, it kind of like bothers them. Is this something that you overcome when you join industry and you see that your work is, maybe it's not being published, but it is impacting a lot of users in other meaningful ways?
So, you know, I chose a team where I was able to publish pretty much as much as I wanted because Chrome is open source and we've generally been fairly open with the public. And, you know, no one stopped me because I chose a team. On the other hand, if you go into kind of a part of industry where you're working on like very secretive stuff that has like, you know, a competitive reason to not talk about it publicly, then, you know, you're not going to publish. But I think the main reason why people in industry don't publish is just that it's not really viewed as necessary for an industry career. Like it's not what your colleagues, like when you go up for a promotion at Google, you don't put your publications on it. You don't like, it's not something that is rewarded in industry. So even though you can do it, a lot of people choose not to do it. And this is in contrast to, you know, in academia where publishing is sort of the most important thing, right? Like that's how you're recognized. That's how you're rewarded. Whereas at Google, you're rewarded when you can say, I made X thing Y% better for this many users. And so your mindset, you know, over time kind of shifts to that. And it's, you know, it seems to be a pretty natural process. But you can publish if you want to. It's just that most people see that like, oh, that's not the thing that people brag about here. And so they sometimes stop doing it. With that being said, there are lots of people who publish. You know, I still published up until a few years ago. I recently stopped, but that's mostly because I'm a manager now and I don't have time to do that type of work. But I encourage other people on my team to publish. I read it, I give feedback. You know, we sometimes set up collaborations outside. I personally still like publishing.
Thank you.
Right. Let's see. Any other questions? Zubair, please help me if I hope I'm not missing anything.
Let me double check Slack really quick.
Checking Slack. I guess there's one question about the Chrome and Chromium duality, I guess.
Did we go through this question from Alan? Sorry.
Yeah, I believe we did. Yes. So there's a question about CVEs and how they affect the two browsers. I'm assuming that because a large code base is in common between them, a CVE for Blink, for example, for the rendering engine would affect both, but then probably there is a part, perhaps there are, I don't know, do you know of any examples of CVEs that affected Chrome but not Chromium, or vice versa?
I think there was once a bug that if like WebRTC might ship with some things that are in like some libraries that are in Chrome but not Chromium at one point, and I think there was a bug there, but that's the only instance I can think of. In general, bugs that affect one affects the other. I can't think of many instances in which, but again, I'm talking about Google shipped Chrome and Google shipped Chromium. There are definitely bugs in other Chromium-based browsers that are not necessarily going to be reflected in Chrome because we don't, like, they can kind of pick and choose what pieces of Chromium they use. The reverse is, you know, can sometimes be true of like, okay, there's maybe a bug in Google-based Chromium. It doesn't automatically necessarily affect other Chromium-based browsers, depending on where the bug is located and which parts of Chromium they've taken.
Nice. Okay.
Can I maybe jump in with one question? Since we have 5 minutes, definitely want to, there are a lot of interesting things. One interesting tidbit from your talk I noticed was this tension that you mentioned when you were trying to, the team was considering like this UC browser feature where they would do the proxy thing, and it's an issue with privacy. And the trade-off between privacy and performance is something you considered. And you mentioned that as you like move up the chain, I guess, like these trade-offs and tensions, you have to like kind of like consider them in a more holistic fashion. So one of the things we are seeing in the MADWeb workshop a little bit this year, but last year, I think there was a lot of debate about this, like there is this big movement towards privacy. And there are many, I think, attendees in this community, perhaps I would consider myself that person as well, who are like more privacy zealots. They don't want to do the trade-off, or they want to play with the trade-off in a really hard way. Is that something, this kind of tension that you see internally at Chrome, or how do you see this kind of like tension where, yeah, maybe you want to do the trade-off, but there is a big part of the community, and some people believe it is the larger society. People do want browsers to be user agent and really take a stand to protect privacy, even if it compromises other aspects.
That's a great question. And I think there are, you know, a few things that we do to try to answer this question. One is we try to understand whether it's a kind of broadly shared privacy need or not. So another thing we try to do is see, okay, if it's, you know, perhaps something that different groups of people may or may not want, like see if there are things we can do with settings or defaults so that we could offer it to, you know, our opt-ins. I think an example of this in the security space is extended safe browsing. You know, we can offer much more robust malware checks, phishing protection, if we have access to more of what's happening in the browser. Now, some people absolutely don't want that, right? Like they don't want Google looking at their file downloads. They don't want Google looking at what's happening in the websites outside of, you know, on the client. And, you know, in order to respect that, we've made this something that's opt-in. So people who feel, or enterprises in particular, who feel they have a business relationship with Google, or just they realize that they're at high risk of certain types of targets and want Google's protection, or, you know, individual users who are concerned about security but not concerned about privacy from Google, have the ability to turn these features on. Now, there are limitations with what you can do with settings. You know, simplicity is kind of another trade-off, right? Like if you put settings all over the browser, it will just be a nightmare to use. We kind of already have that problem. If you look right next to the Omnibox, even, like there's just like a string of icons there, right? And like, this is a problem. We need to figure out what to do about that. That's not security related, but it's just, you know, like there's this kind of accretion of settings and features that people never find out about. So there are kind of limitations, and we try to be very selective about like, okay, extended safe browsing, that's something really important. We want to offer this as a trade-off, but you know, we can't do that to solve every trade-off question. You know, I think something else we can do if it's a setting is think about different markets. So maybe in one country, this is on by default. In other countries, it might be off by default based on, you know, what we think is likely to be desired in that location. We're trying some new browser segmentation approaches where we try to classify users based on what we think they will want to use or what choices we think they'll want to make. And then kind of enabling or disabling features for them or making them maybe more visually prominent. We haven't done this with anything privacy related yet, because I think, you know, there's like some obvious questions of like, well, what if we misclassify you? Like, but it's something we've been using for other features that perhaps could be used in the future for security or privacy related things if we became more confident in our ability to correctly guess what people want.
There is a hand raised by Karthika. Maybe we have the last question.
Yeah, okay. Hey, Adriana, I just wanted to ask about like the users' mentality that you've been observing. Would you say the users are becoming more security conscious now and trying to opt in for more like these privacy related options and security features, and how that like, does that affect Chrome's working and other features?
So I would say that people have become a lot more privacy conscious over time. And not just in the United States, but broadly around the world. I think people are more and more concerned about who has access to what data. I think rightfully so. I'm concerned about this myself. You know, you're seeing this reflected, for example, in legislation in some cases, like in the EU, and you know, in other places you see primarily reflected in the mood of press stories, but we also hear about it when we speak from users too. And I think that's great. I think it reflects that people are starting to understand the impact of technology on their own lives. Security, on the other hand, is something that I feel like most people want it to just work and be secure, and they don't want to have to think about it or make trade-offs about it. And in many cases, I think people resent if we're at like, you know, oh, you're asking me, do I want it to be more secure? Like, yes, of course, make it secure. Like, don't ask me about it. Whereas privacy, I think people are more interested lately in wanting to have a say in their privacy stance and where their data goes.